Let's get started. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for those who have joined us for the third in our series of DEI Knowledge Exchange webinars. My name is Paul Modley and I am the Managing Director for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at AMS, and I'm delighted to be joined by a stellar panel this afternoon. Before introducing the panelists, let me introduce you to my co-facilitator, Judy Ellis. Judy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Judy Ellis, Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory at AMS. And in that role, I support our clients on a consulting basis. And very happy to be here, as Paul mentioned, with a very distinguished panel.
Thank you, Judy. So let's meet our panelists. Kate, I'm going to start with you first. Would you mind introducing yourself?
No, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Judy. Hi, everybody. My name is Kate Matthews. I'm the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Lead at BP for our Eastern Hemisphere region, which is EMEA and Asia Pacific. And
you're based where, Kate?
I'm based in London, or in my house currently, but normally in London. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Right, I'm just going to go around the room. Nick, could I come to you next?
Hello, yes, great to see you all. My name is Nick Creswell. I lead the Global Culture and Talent team at Ørsted, the renewable energy developer. I've been based out of Copenhagen for the last 3 years. That's where we have our biggest presence is in Denmark, but also we're rapidly growing all around the world. And leading culture and talent obviously includes a very strong focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of that. And I use the pronouns he and him.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick. May, could I come to you next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here with you. My name is May Zhou. I am responsible for programmatic hiring for Barclays globally. Barclays, as some of you may know, is a UK-based universal bank. And what we define as programmatic essentially is hiring into talent acquisition any graduates, interns, or apprentice into the organization. My teams are based out in Asia, the UK, Europe, and in the Americas. And I am speaking to you guys from New York. So excited to be here.
Thank you, May. Last but not certainly least, Claudia.
Hi, yes, good to meet everyone. I'm Claudia Nuttgens. I'm a chartered occupational psychologist and I head up the AMS Assessment and Selection Advisory team. But I have a background in OD and leadership development as well, so coming at it from a multi-disciplinary perspective today.
Thank you, Claudia. So let's get started. So the topic for today is making inclusive leadership a reality. And I am sure we're going to have a very healthy debate with our panelists. Let me just kind of set the scene before handing over to Judy. We would love this session to be as interactive as we can possibly make it. So please do share comments or any questions in the chat box and we'll endeavour to pick them up. We do also have a couple of polls that we may get to depending on how the flow of the conversation goes. So we'd like to get the audience participating, but yeah, please do get involved, share your comments and any questions that you have as we go through. Judy is going to be kind of running the main session and I may be interrupting as we go through just to bring questions in and to keep us on time. So without any further ado, let me hand across to Judy.
Thanks, Paul. And to get us kicked off, I would just like each of you as panelists, if you would answer the question, what are really the key ingredients for good inclusive leadership? And I'll start with you, Kate, if you don't mind.
Oh, thank you. That's good. I get to go first, so I get the easy ones. I mean, the key ingredients around inclusive leadership are, I think we would agree, emotional intelligence and being able to connect with people. So understanding, and so that's a skill, and we know that can be built. A lot of people are gifted in that sense, but everyone can develop emotional intelligence and understanding and paying attention to the people around you and really knowing your people and taking the time and being curious about them is key to being a good inclusive leader. I'll stop there so that others can add.
Thank you. Nick, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think we'll probably pretty quickly get a bit of a thread going here, because I think the way I would define it is a really inclusive leader leads with the heart as much as they lead with the head. In fact, if not more with the heart than they do with the head. Because anybody can deal with the facts and figures and the harder stuff, but it's when you get into the more nuanced, more behavioral, more emotional topics that really inclusive leadership comes into its own. So I think it's all about leading with the heart as much as leading with the head.
I think that's important. And I just saw a neat article that said, let's stop calling it soft skills and let's call human skills. Some of the leadership skills picks up on that theme of leading with the heart. May, I'll come to you. What would you add as an important element of inclusive leadership?
Yeah, in addition to, and I will wholeheartedly agree with the comments discussed prior, but I guess, encouraging authenticity, right? Like, I think we all come from different backgrounds. We bring different skills, different life experience to the table, to our respective teams. And so encouraging, who you are and bringing that to the table is really, really important for me. And I think for, sort of the organization in which we all work in. In banking, there's always this sort of a perception that it's, pretty tight rounded. And you have to keep yourself in line. And there's a sort of expectation, be it real or unreal, that people, may not be able to sort of share a little bit more of personality. So I do think when we think about being leaders and how we lead by example, it is about just encouraging, bringing yourself, bringing who you are, and, trying to put all the other noise behind to say, I need to, put myself into this situation because I am working in a certain industry. So I think that's important.
And Claudia, I come to you last because you're on the subject, I think, being an industrial psychologist, but there's been various studies. Deloitte has come out with their framework for inclusive leadership, but I'd love to hear from you what you see as really some of those key factors important in inclusive leadership.
Well, yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what's already been said, and obviously had a list and ticking off the things you've already said. I think, though, there's a layer over the top, which is you have to be intentional about this, that it's not enough for it to be authentic and heartfelt. It has to be intentional and actually deliberate, and effort goes into this. Doesn't happen by happy accident because you happen to be a nice person. So that would be my thing. And in a funny way, I think head is quite important here, because I think you need to be informed and intellectually curious as well as emotionally open. So that's a slightly probably nerdier answer, but I would say that I would look for those things as well as being important.
There's a question that's just come from the audience, which I think is a good time to bring it in. And maybe Kate, you could pick this up. You referred to emotional intelligence. How do we support our leaders to become more emotionally intelligent? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I was nodding vigorously when Claudia was talking, actually, because I very much agree with what she's saying, and I think that echoes this question. There is effort involved, and I think that's perhaps where leaders are reluctant to. They will lean into the hard skills, and they'll accept that they need to do a course on accounting or something very technical, but expect those are often perceived as natural skills. Just either they've got them or they haven't. And Claudia's quite right to call out. It takes effort, and so we support our leaders actually by pointing that out to them, holding them accountable for demonstrating it, and giving them feedback. So both positive and constructive feedback. And I think creating a space, and for me this is another thing about inclusive leadership, but creating a space where mistakes can be made, where you can set ground rules about how you're going to have conversations, that say, you know, for example, in the DE&I space, I really want to have a conversation about whatever it is, whether it's race or LGBT or something else, where people might feel a little anxious and worried about saying the wrong thing and causing offense, but creating that safe space to say, let's have that conversation and let's know we're in this conversation with the right intention. And if somebody makes a mistake, uses the wrong language, perhaps missteps, we'll, with kindness, point that out. And but make that a practice. That's a practice. That's not something that just comes from being a nice person, to Claudia's point. I think that's encouraging that and supporting our leaders by making it part of the expectation.
I like that, Kate. I think you brought home how important it is to be intentional, kind of connecting head, heart, and even hands for action is important. And creating psychological safety, that was one of the poll questions we put out in advance of this webinar, asking how safe would you feel to take a risk with your boss in a meeting? And I think about 30% of people said I'd feel really safe, and almost 30% of people said I would not feel safe. Or how disagreeing with a boss, I think, was the actual term. And I think we'll launch our first poll question because it picks up a theme that we've talked about. We've kind of said the answer, but we'll see if our participants were listening in. And if you could, you can point your camera phone, smartphone at the screen on this QR code, which will take you right to the first poll question. Or I think our team will also drop a link in the chat if it's difficult for you to access it that way. And you can look in the chat and just press on the link there. So as you'll see, our first poll question really asks about inclusive leadership. Can inclusive leadership skills be taught, or are you born with them? And I think we've already heard, we're seeing that they can be taught because we kind of gave that answer, and Kate brought it in.
But you'll agree.
Yeah. And I think, you know, just reinforcing that, as you said, Kate, some people naturally may have more interest and ability with people skills, but it takes more to really be effective at that, because we're not just saying be nice to people. We're saying pay attention, create an environment where your entire team feels safe and can discuss the kinds of things that you talked about. So thank you for participating in that poll. I'll come to you now, Nick, and I've heard you say before that inclusive leadership is really good leadership. Can you expound on that and say what you really mean by that?
Yeah, and actually I smile as you ask me that, because for those who saw my teaser video that I did to help promote this, I mentioned it there. And it's actually something I've been going around saying for a while, and that was inspired by our CEO at Ørsted. We had a sort of engagement session for some of our senior leaders, or several of them back to back at the end of last year. And at the very end of it, as our CEO, Maz Nipper, was closing it out, he said, you know, the thing about inclusive leadership is it's just good leadership. And so I just thought it was such a great comment, and I've been going around saying that all the time. And then I was asked to explain it by you. Maybe I had some advance warning this. I was like, right, okay, I better actually define what I actually mean. So thank you for that question. Look, fundamentally what it comes down to is that we all know that diverse teams lead to better results. That you know, diversity is a real foundation of success in any kind of organization, and certainly in business. And we also know that people perform better when they can be themselves, to quote that famous Stonewall tagline that's been around for a while. So really, it's a leader's role to help the individual perform as well as they can when they can be themselves. And that comes from giving people a voice to show up as themselves and create a platform to bring their best. And then what that boils down to is creating an environment of, guess what, psychological safety. So, you know, you need to have an environment where giving and receiving feedback is normal, where people know each other in the team, where people feel free to collaborate and to disagree and to have even some constructive conflict, but also to find a way forward through that conflict as well. And then to deal with things as they actually are rather than they should be. And so all of that means that you need to adapt to the needs of the individual, whilst also finding the common thread between the group of individuals who are in the team. So I think, what it fundamentally comes down to is creating a platform where people can be themselves, but then work effectively together. And you know what? That's easy to say. It's a lot more difficult to do. But we do know that it's the right thing to do, and it leads to better results.
Yes, and I think the element that's important is that it's in being a good leader, focusing on DEI. Sometimes people think you're only focusing on a particular group, but being a good inclusive leader means everyone on your team is going to feel safer and take more risk and have more innovative responsibilities, not just a particular demographic. May, I'll come to you. I know you're really a leader of a global team with the campus recruiting function. How have you seen inclusive leadership show up on your recruiting teams?
Yeah, and this really transitions well sort of into Nick's comments, right? It's about creating that sense of trust and being able to have the conversations, be it positive, negative, be able to share some feedback. I think the silver lining to COVID has been, for me as a leader, and I think for many, we've sort of seen much of the publication around this, is that we all had to get intentional because, we were not in the same location. We were working in different sort of remote locations or whatever the arrangement may be. And now we're sort of hybrid. So it continues even beyond sort of the pandemic time. But I've had to recently transition into a large global team and lead that effort. And I think when I reflect on that, I do believe, creating that environment is by leading and opening with the opening bit of trust. And so I've had, a team, all hands meeting, with everybody, the larger, broader team, but I've also created time individually, not just with my direct reports, but all the team members. It may not be frequent because my calendar gets crazy, but I do try to intentionally block time off to spend with everyone so that I can create that personal relationship, that I can get to know somebody, as I would going to the bathroom or passing them by the coffee pantry and having a quick chat and learning about their day or about their kids or about their life situation. So it is creating that time, even if it's just a 20-minute catch up or a 30-minute catch up. But I have always opened with those, particularly the ones that, I'm meeting for the first time, to really be intentional about, I am coming into this role. I am very much open to your experience so far, and that I lead and I open with a trusting relationship. Obviously, I need to build that credibility with the individual, but I want them to feel and understand that I've already, am invested in their success and want to be very much sort of tethered to their overall experience and ensuring that they're having a positive one, both personally and professionally. So I think that, when I reflect on my integration into Barclays has been really helpful, and me being able to create a safe space amongst my immediate team, immediate directs, and then also those levels below them as well.
I like how you have made space for being new on the team, recognizing that everyone across the globe has different expectations. And I heard a tone of vulnerability there in you sharing. And I'd like to pick up on that with you, Kate. If you wouldn't mind, could you talk about how important vulnerability is in really achieving inclusive leadership?
It builds on the comments I made earlier, principally, which is being this whole being human piece. In the past, leaders were expected to know all the answers. We all know the world has become more complex in every possible sense, and indeed even our understanding of who we are. And we don't really want from our leaders certainty, because we don't trust it. Like none, and we can just think about political political environment, and when a politician these days tries to tell you the way things are, then you're much more likely to question it than generations before, who would have been happy to accept that we have access to so much more information, we have different perspectives on the world. And where that ties back to vulnerability is, if the leader then is saying, I know the answer, because they feel that is what is asked, they will actually lose credibility with their people. And showing the vulnerability means saying, I don't know the answer, but together we can find the answer. And it might mean that that I need to learn stuff. And the play there into D&I, as we were saying before, we can only really know our own lived experience. We can do our very, very best to really lean into our empathy, empathy strengths and try to understand that everybody else's, but we can only really know our own. So we will all need to hold that vulnerability in the conversations that we're having, and be willing to be taught in reverse. So I think that sort of brings to life literally the activities that May was describing around creating a currency of conversation with your people, and I think May, you were sharing, being personal about yours, sharing personal stuff around oneself. So I've so many times myself had days where I've shared challenges I'm having in my personal life with my children, or my parents and their health, and actually what I get back is, oh, it's good to hear you share that, because I've also got that. But so by giving that vulnerability, you're sort of opening the door for others to say, actually, I'm also struggling with that, but I might not have told you that because I didn't know if that was okay. So just building that trust is what I'd offer.
And I think it's so important to get real answers from people versus what you think they want to say. And part of building trust is being vulnerable yourself and not always having all the answers.
Exactly.
Nick,
and I also, and sorry, Kay, I was also going to say sharing examples, right? Like being relatable. In campus recruiting, gosh, those who manage teams would have done a lot of the work that recruiters are doing. So for me, it comes to life. And in terms of everyone's learning from mistakes and being able to share that. And so when I hear about mistakes, or when someone's afraid to open up to me about a mistake they've sort of just experienced or going through, I often will sort of say, well, yeah, in my early days, I've certainly done my share of errors with recruiting, or, had no idea the seniority of the panelists that I was on, and, made a blunder in some way or other. And I think, again, it just brings back the human side of who we are. And then through that, you connect a little bit deeper, because clearly I've made many, many mistakes, and I continue to make them. But I try not to shy away from them, and to the point that it sort of ties into what's happening with my team member. I think sharing that in that real time is really helpful. It has certainly been. In the campus recruiting space, obviously, we're working with students, so it's a little lighthearted in general. So it's maybe a little easier, but nonetheless still very important to sort of have relatable experiences with individual team members.
And I think maybe leaders of yesteryear would cringe hearing us saying the leaders sharing vulnerabilities, that the leader was the boss and had all the answers when I started in my career. Nick, I'd love to hear from you. Have you seen vulnerability as being an important new key leadership skill?
100%. It's such an important element of leadership these days. And I think it was actually Goffey and Jones who back in 2000 did some research around this. And one of the qualities they found of a great leader was that they did reveal what Goffey and Jones described as being selective weakness. So sort of people choosing to show what it was that they weren't so good at to make themselves a bit more relatable. And as they said, if you're a chief financial officer, you're probably not going to say I'm not so good at accounting, but you might say that maybe I work too much. That's the old classic interview question of your weaknesses or whatever. But I think I think leaders, all of us as individuals, as leaders, we know our deficiencies, we know our shortcomings, but we tend to cover them with a bit of armor, so to speak, and we often try to overcompensate for them. And I think, as both Kate and May have indicated, complicated. It actually, people relate to us as leaders so much more when we acknowledge we don't have all the answers, but you know what, together we can figure out something that is good enough to take us forward, even if it isn't the perfect answer. And a couple of examples of that, of where I've seen that sort of come to life. One did actually happen quite by accident earlier this year. I just woke up one morning and I really just wasn't feeling great about things. You know, it was just one of those days. And so I sort of, but I have my coping mechanisms for those kind of days, not least going for a good walk at the start of the day and actually clearing out some time from my calendar and just getting time to just reset. And I ended up posting about it on LinkedIn, and I couldn't believe the response I got to it, both online and also offline as well. And it really struck me how much people value those kind of signals from a leader, that, you know, I have days where I don't feel okay, and to pass that on shows that it's okay when others don't as well. And another example might be, you know, one thing I learned on a leadership program a few years ago is something called a lifeline, where you can tell the ups and downs of your life story and your career story in sort of quite a compressed way, but that really sort of shows where you've been successful and also where, you know, things haven't worked out. And I've learned that sharing that story with people, particularly when I'm new to leading them, makes a huge difference to them understanding that I'm not this like perfectly formed leader who just arrived with some big job title and gets everything right, you know, every time. But actually, you know, I've arguably learned more through failures and through things not working out than I have through the successes. And again, that seems to resonate with people and reassure them we don't have to be perfect all the time, but you know what, we'll give it our best as often as we can.
There's a comment from somebody in the audience who has made a comment. I posed a question really about, you know, is it, you know, do we think that most leaders can concur that vulnerability is important? And a comment from Susie is that, you know, she feels probably a lot of our current leaders are struggling with it, but there's a view that maybe our future leaders who are learning in a different way may be able to show vulnerability in a way that our current leaders can't. So interesting comment there.
I saw that question, and I think it's a really good point. And I think what it highlights actually is the importance of working with cohorts of senior leaders, because what we really care about quite often is what our peers think of us, particularly if we're CEOs and you know, C-suite. So what do my peers think? So they won't want to show vulnerability because they're worried that their peers are going to judge them. So doing work in a creating trust within those groups and creating that vulnerability actually there is where you need to start quite often if you're going to change a culture in an organization, I think.
I do think there's cultural shifts, and I think we always think the next generation will just naturally do X better. And I've heard that probably 2 or 3 times over my 20+ year career now about all kinds of DEI issues. And I think it comes back to intentionality, because you know, there are ebbs and flows in this thing. There's ebbs and flows in leadership theories that are kind of de rigueur. I think it's important for every generation to pay attention to what's happening. We also have, you know, shifting lanes a little, keeping track of what's happening and looking at data and being data informed so that you're having good decisions when it comes to a leadership discussion is important. And Kate, I'd really like you to pick up on how collection of diversity data is important and how it helps to inform inclusive leadership.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. Well, it's a really big focus for us at BP. And that's because we feel we've done a lot of work on culture and trying to shift behaviours. But we really want to see the impact of it. And that's where the data counts. We can't really understand if we're making progress without it. And I think for leaders, what it does is it will encourage leaders if they can start to see shifts in retention and attraction and engagement scores. Those are the kind of things we're looking at for particular groups, and they can see that their behaviours are making a difference. And equally, if their behaviours are not making a difference, then it helps them to start to inquire further to understand why not. So for me, a lot of the challenges we have in D&I and in trying to increase representation for underrepresented groups is about a sort of funneling down. So we can start with a hypothesis of why we think perhaps a group is underrepresented. We can implement some practices to address that. And hiring is a good example where quite often we'll introduce, for example, blind CVs or something like that, and see if it makes a difference. And then if you're looking at the data, if you're tracking the data, you can see if it's actually making a difference. And if it isn't making a difference, you can ask a different question. So it enables a much more sort of systematic and structured approach to understanding the problem. I think quite often in a lot of HR space actually, but in D&I, we kind of think we know the answer. And I think I've already said that we only know our own lived experience. So it's a pretty dangerous thing to do when you're thinking about people from different backgrounds to yourself. You can't really know. So you have to go in there. And I think being data-led allows that. It allows transparency, it allows accountability for change.
I like that, and I'm a very big proponent of making sure you can slice and dice your data by demographics, because I've had, especially as you mentioned, underrepresented populations are sometimes such a smaller voice in a very large organization, and you may hear one overarching theme, but then when you slice it and look at what are, our employees in India saying versus here, geographic difference comes up, often ethnic diversity differences and their experiences come up. I saw recently that one transportation organization said having employee sentiment data reach the same level across all demographic groups as their bar. It's like when white males are as happy here as white females, as Hispanic, or Latinx women, Asian males, then we'll feel like we're really doing well. So I really agree that it's important to look at the data and look at it from a demographic lens. Claudia, with your assessment hat, I'm wondering if you could share how we really might be able to assess for inclusive leadership skills.
Yes, very timely question, because I actually had a call just today looking at a toolkit we're developing for someone, and we were talking to the head of DEI and talking about how we make sure that we weave in inclusive leadership into the measurement that we do at certain levels. And I think I've been in this industry a long time. We know that there are off-the-shelf products on the market that supposedly assess unconscious bias. Now, we would really warn against the use of those in assessment for selection, particularly because they are, it's a state, not a trait, and depends on context. So the sorts of things that we tend to look for, and all the research suggests that you should look for, are things around in the big 5-factor model of personality. So anyone on the call who kind of knows about that, we would look for openness to experience. We'd look for sort of agreeableness, interpersonal sensitivity. So people's sort of natural preferences for those are a good indicator of someone's inclination towards inclusivity. It's not a watertight measure, but it certainly gives you a kind of link. We would never use that on its own. But then we're looking for things around humility, learning, orientation as well, because knowing that you don't know all the answers and that you're really interested in developing your mindset, I think that's really important. We do a lot of measurement of this concept really within our more bespoke sort of later stage assessment. So we would look at things like structured interview questions that really dig deep, and then also things around assessment center exercises that have particular scenarios. We use situational judgment assessments with these things woven in. One of the big things, obviously assessment is a very, very important piece of data collection within DEI. So it can be a very, very valuable piece to really define whether there's a problem. And one of the things we also do is sort of talk about the role of the leader in inclusive hiring. And I think, so it's a huge piece around creating processes that feel inclusive to candidates, that really genuinely feel like they are being heard and being valued, whatever group they come from in that process. So that's a slightly long answer to a short question. There's lots of different ways of doing it, basically.
Claudia,
Yeah.
can I just ask a follow-up question? Is it possible to look at measuring inclusive leadership at an organisation level? You've talked about how you can assess it by individual, but could an organisation try and assess its inclusive leadership across its organisation and put a score on that?
Yeah, I would imagine that there are people out there who definitely have products. It's not something I'm aware of. I mean, there's lots of indexes out there that people can do to kind of drive that culture. I suppose what I would say is that to treat inclusion as if it's a separate concept, sometimes I kind of worry a little bit that we're over measuring everything. But so that actually, if you've got a decent culture and inclusion is at the very heart of what you're trying to achieve, it shouldn't need a separate measure. The data is telling you whether or not you're getting it right. I don't know, Judy may disagree with me actually, and maybe that's a point of conversation around this, but it's not something, I mean, but remember I was in OD a few years ago, and it may have moved on since then.
Yeah, I have seen, and I'm certified in the intercultural development inventory, and you can, although it's an individual assessment, you can do it for organizations and even particular business units. And it comes with what they call an intercultural development plan, which gives you kind of some activities to do to increase exposures, education, and actively get involved in learning across different orientations and mindsets. And if you, according to the data they have, if you're intentional about working on that, you can move on this continuum with a year's worth of concerted work. So there are some frames for doing that, and I have to share with you, Claudia, sometimes so we can pick your brain about how you feel about that product. I do think it's important to know that there's lots of streams of leadership theory that come through, so to speak, over the years. And Claudia, I know we've talked about different types of leadership styles that can support inclusive leadership. And I'm wondering if you could add any clarity on that and how you see things like servant leadership, for example, supporting inclusive leadership.
Yeah, no, it comes back to Kate's reference to this sort of that leaders can't be heroes, and I think that shouldn't be heroes. It can't. That doesn't work as an inclusive behaviour anymore. So I think and actually I did a bit more of a kind of deep dive into some of the kind of critiques of some of the idea of inclusive leadership and how it aligns to, say, things like servant leadership or transformation leadership or authentic leadership, and all of those sorts of models, which are not about heroes, they're not about charisma, they're not about traits that are inherent in the individual. They're about sort of behavioural mindset more than anything else. Those all do align quite well with inclusivity. There are some sort of problems with, say, servant leadership. I think that when you look at, there's a bit of critique around that. That it's got some quite sort of paternalistic tones to it, which could be problematic if you're too sort of so if it's too paternalistic, it's too much like we're taking care of you. So that it's an interesting one, but I think anything that isn't around this leader is the know-all, this is know-it-all, this leader is the one that's going to save us all, and that's the kind of thing that we need to get away from, I guess.
Great. Can I throw a question in from the audience? Great question. Have you seen a change in team behaviour with inclusive leadership. And I'd love to get some insight from Kate, May, and Nick on that one, maybe from your own organisations currently, or where you may have seen this previously. Kate, can I pick on you first? Have you sort of seen a change in team behaviour where there's good inclusive leadership?
I think I've seen it hundreds of times and maybe not noticed it.
Right.
In terms of, you know when you see a team that seems to be really suffering, and then they have a change of leader, and all of a sudden blooms flower everywhere, and that for me is what's going on. The leader has come in and just changed the environment and made people feel safer. I do have a specific example at a previous organisation I was at, which is what inspired my earlier comment. We did some work with the C-suite to create that development and really shift away from the sort of hero leadership we've been talking around to a more vulnerable leadership state. And I was working in an industry where there'd been a huge change. So there'd been a lot of certainty in the past. There'd been a huge external change that meant that the future was no longer certain. And so that group really needed to, reassess how they led. And the CEO took the time to work with us, and we work with an external partner to develop those inclusive leadership traits within the group and do lots of exploration and the vulnerability. We'd go for walks with them, we're doing different things that were different, taking them out and having experiential learning at the British Museum, practicing storytelling, demonstrating vulnerability among themselves. So that was my inspiration for that other suggestion, which just came to mind. And the trickle down was significant because the shadow they cast, changed. We started to see a real shift in the culture. So that was the most powerful example I've seen of that.
Thank you for that. I think when we seeing these things implemented, as you said, sometimes we don't notice what the change is, but beginning to create an environment. I mean, they're just tips and tools like not answering as a leader and letting your team give their answers first to a complex problem so that you don't have groupthink happening. Often those kinds of things encourage more inclusivity on a team and allow people to feel safe enough to give their responses. And then you see things like you said, Kate, teams flourishing all of a sudden when it's just a slight change. I'd like to,
sorry. I was just going to say there's also a practical implementation that I've done with the former team. When we're relatively new, we've always opened team meetings up with like, what's gone wrong? Share an example of something that you thought would have worked one way, but happened another. And again, it creates that safe space for everyone to sort of learn from mistakes, right? So in that regard, I think from just a practicality perspective, one of the things that we've incorporated into some of our meetings when relevant in the right time of year, we've also opened with sharing.
I think that's important, and it does encourage that open, honest dialogue that helps people to feel safe, as you mentioned. I'd like to launch our next poll question now. So we will, you can point your phone or camera at the screen again at this QR code to answer our next poll question. And after we give people a moment to connect there, we'll also add a link to the question in the chat if that's easier for you to access. But our next question is really, which of the following inclusive leadership traits could you improve on the most? And the options we have are seeking missing perspectives, being curious about other cultures, encouraging people to speak up, or admitting mistakes. So we'll give our audience a minute to answer which of the following inclusive leadership traits you could improve on the most. So we're kind of at a tie between seeking missing perspectives and encouraging people to speak up is catching up quickly. Yeah, thinking about like just personality differences, extroverts versus introverts. And perhaps as a leader, asking your introverts to answer first, or giving them the answers before your team meeting so that they have that reflective time to be prepared and answer. Or some tips for how do you encourage other people to speak up. And seeking missing perspectives. It's hard to know when everyone at the table is, saying, agreeing or thinks you have it solved, but sometimes going, who have we not asked? What stakeholder group have we not heard from? Is a way to seek out that missing perspective, or to assign a person the role at every meeting of playing devil's advocate. It's another nice tool that I like. So that no one feels on the spot. It's like, okay, this week, Judy, after we finish, you tell us what we're missing or who we may not have thought of asking. And then the next week, someone else can have that role as well. So now we have a complete tie. But being curious about other cultures, admitting mistakes, something we've talked about already, have gotten less votes. So that means we're doing well with that as an audience. So thank you for participating. So we do have, as Paul has put in the chat, we have about only 10 minutes left to go. So if you have any final questions or comments, please feel free to add those to the chat. I will have another kind of round robin question for all our panelists, and it's personal. I'd like to know if you've worked for a leader in the past with whom you felt very supported by, and if so, what is it that that leader did that caused you to feel supported? And Claudia, I don't know if you can think of a leader. We haven't heard from you in a minute. Have you had that great experience of working for a leader with whom you felt very supported?
Well, I suppose I can only come at it from a kind of, I guess, a female working mother perspective in a leadership position, and I guess we share a boss, Judy, and I guess my current boss happens to also have that profile, and I guess in that respect, I've felt AMS has been a very comfortable place for me to be very open about the priorities I have to make with, working with two teenagers, essentially. So yes, I've definitely come from that perspective. I think I have worked in teams where it has been very male dominated, and at the time I felt reasonably supported, but looking back, I probably had learned to put up and shut up with some of the behaviours. And I'm sure that's not an unusual experience for many of the women on this call, especially say 15, 20 years ago, especially when I was younger. But yeah, that would be my current experience is a positive one.
I can relate to that, especially early career. I had a boss ask, because I have 4 children, who asked me, why are you having another child? Are you just wanting to be on the mommy track? And I was like, no, I really need to work even more now, actually, to provide for all these children. So yes, I think I'm happy to hear often things have changed in many ways in that regard. I don't know, May or Kate, if you would like to add in, have you worked for a leader with whom you felt very supportive in the past, and what did they do that made you feel that way?
Well, I can start, Kate. I'm sure you have lots of examples too, but when I think about where I am now and where I started as a recruiter, I've seen my own sort of definition of leadership change and evolve, right? In my earlier days, I had this amazing supportive manager, just very nice, and provided me the psychological safety, meaning I knew, he would always be very complimentary, would always be very open to hearing my ideas, giving me a different perspective, leaning in as and when I needed. you can almost even, at that point in my younger self, I would say he's way too nice. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm working for someone who's way too nice. I actually want to work for someone who's inspirational, who pushes me, who's like a little bit of a tough ass. But he wasn't. He was the complete opposite. And I almost left that role or left that company because I thought, again, in my younger days, I thought I wanted to be with someone who comes up with these great ideas, you know, pushes innovation, like allows for us to stretch. But again, when I think about myself now and my advice to young people when they're seeking roles or seeking jobs, and if they had two to compare, my general advice is get a real understanding of which team has your best interest in mind and which manager do you feel the most comfortable in the sense that you get the comfort of them being aligned to your overall success and will lean in to help you understand the landscape, or, you know, would take the 5 minutes to sit down and explain a concept to you that you may not, you know, be aware of. I was like, those are the type of teams that you want to align yourself with now, all else being equal. And so I've seen my own evolved, you know, definition of what a leader is. In the past, it used to be sort of someone who has the answers. Now I want someone who actually is supportive, and that's the type of role that I want to play for my team, is to sort of be very open to different perspectives, and actually, you know, hopefully I'm not categorized as being too nice, but there's nothing wrong with that, and in fact I think it's encouraged now. And so those are, you know, when I think about my prior manager, he was such a gem, and it's because he really led with a lot of compliments and support.
I think it's interesting. I heard a leader say just last year at a training I was doing that he called it HR fluff and stuff, meaning being really nice. And it's like, you can be kind and compassionate and have accountability and push people to achieve. It's not a binary thing. And Nick, I think I'd like to come to you. What do you really see as important qualities in support of inclusive leadership? Have you had a leader that's been really supportive of you? And could you talk about what made them supportive?
Yeah, maybe this is where I come back to the point that inclusive leadership is good leadership, because it's a bit difficult to differentiate them being just a good manager from being an inclusive manager. But maybe two quick examples. One is, I think there's something that Claudia picked up on about when you share an experience because of your demographic, that can make a big difference. So as a gay man myself, 20 years ago, when I was managed by another gay man, we kind of got what it was like to be gay in the workplace in 2000, which was, you know, still quite challenging then, and arguably it can be now. So, and just sort of, you know, it was a great role model for me to how to be himself and how to talk about his life and his partner and his and his husband and so on in a work context. So that was quite inspirational for me. And then another particularly important leader for me was back in 2009, the first time I was managed by someone who was really quite senior when I was at Thomson Reuters, and she was at SVP level. And I didn't get a lot of time with her, but I always remember the first time I ever met her, sort of when we were actually into a reporting relationship, she told me her story. And we started at the beginning, and we sort of walked through a little bit of her, you know, a high level of her story. And I remember that so well. And although I didn't get that much time with her on an ongoing basis, we really had such a strong connection as a result of having started with the basics and really sort of getting to know each other. So I think that's an example of how making that personal connection, finding ways to get to know each other, even when you don't necessarily have a lot of time together, can make a big, big difference.
There's a lot in those two stories, especially how important it is for people to share their own lived experience and to say that it's okay to have this experience. It's okay for me to be a gay man if my boss is talking about this in the work context. And we often can forget, I think, how representation really matters, and it can be inspiring, and it could allow people to open up and be their authentic selves. Can
I just jump in with a quick follow-up on that? Of course, when we come from our own demographic, there's only a sort of relatively small number of people we're going to share that demographic with. So then there's a thing here, then there's a piece about how can I take my own experience of what it's like to be different and try and put myself in the shoes of the person I'm leading, even if they actually have a very, very different lived experience. And so I can't assume that just my lived experience can be the same as theirs, but at least it might be able to sort of build some connections and so on. So.
Exactly. And in training, that's a key goal I have, is if you take, have empathy from the experiences you've had where you may have been an outsider, so to speak, what that felt like for you, what helped you, and then you transfer that to people from other demographics. That really helps to build empathy and give you that sense of walking in other people's shoes. That's a really important point. I see we're almost at time. Kate, I want to give you an opportunity, if you have time, to talk about an inclusive leader that you've worked for in the past and what made them a good leader for you.
I'll tell you a quick story. I've got a few examples, but this is really powerful. When I was when I had two small boys, you can probably see my photos here, they don't look like that anymore, they're massive now. My nanny resigned. I had a nanny, I was fortunate and that I had that support, but she resigned. And I just thought, I was working in financial services, it's a very stressful job. And I was like, that's it, I can't do it, it's too much, I can't manage. My nanny's resigned, I need to resign. And I went to my line manager, I said, it's not, my nanny's resigned, I need to resign. And I think many people may have worked for managers who went, oh, that's a shame, okay. And she went, because she had my lived experience. So this is to Paul's, to Nick's point, there is a double-edged sword here, but she was like, come with me. And we went in, I was 2 down from the head of HR, and she took me in to sit with the head of HR, and the 2 of them sat and said to me, go away, you can get through this, just sort it out, you'll find another nanny, it will be okay. And this is not the moment to ditch your career because of a hiccup. This is a hiccup. This is not a huge crevice in your path. And I often think about that. I think I could have been in a very different management relationship, and it was that it's those sort of interventions. I think that was a very specific example, but I'm very grateful to both of those women for being great allies for me.
Very powerful example as well.
I think we're
and on that note, we're at time. So can I firstly let me thank the panelists for an amazing conversation and discussion. As ever, lots of great content, lots of great insight that have been shared. So thank you very much from me for your time and participation. And I'll hand over to Judy just for a final comment before we close.
Yes, so I want to thank you all again, and I know the themes that stick for me are intentionality, and that being vulnerable and sharing just a little goes a long way. So thank you for participating in this series. For us, our next webinar is on internal mobility, and you can see through our social media channels when that's coming up. But we're really pleased to be talking about the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion on internal mobility. So thank you again, and we look forward to meeting you again next time.